Have you ever worked on a project that either took you a lot more time and wasted, or maybe we shouldn't say wasted, but spent a lot more money than you thought, or took you barely any time at all compared to what you thought it was going to take? This all comes back to what we're talking about in this video today, which is how to set a realistic project timeline, particularly as a small to medium-sized business. Setting these more realistic timelines ensure that you stay organized, meet your goals, and avoid burnout. My name is Erica. I am a certified project management professional, and I own my own project management consulting firm. And so I make some videos on YouTube to educate small to medium-sized business owners on the opportunity cost that they are costing themselves by not having really solid project management principles in place. Whether their business is 1 person, 10 people, 50 people, 500 people, 1,000 people. So today we're going to go over some tips and just some guidelines on how you can better estimate, how you can better define your project timelines so you're not experiencing either finishing projects way too fast and not correctly scoping the resources, or being over timeline, over budget, and ultimately falling further and further behind. So the first tip is scoping appropriately. Firstly, what is the cost of not scoping appropriately? There are inevitable direct financial costs with budget overruns. There's labor costs, of course. You're going to have more billable hours on your project than you previously thought. There's the opportunity cost. A lot of projects are very time sensitive, and if they aren't delivered in time because they weren't scoped correctly, that is an opportunity cost. And there's also a reputation risk. So if you're working either with vendors or a client and your project isn't scoped right and you deliver way too fast or way too slow, there is definitely going to be some raised eyebrows and some extra questions that you probably don't want, to be coming down on your brand, right? As an example, McKinsey, which is a major consulting firm, works with the big boys. They estimate that 98% of construction projects are not scoped correctly, and that's costing the industry somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.6 trillion per year. This is serious bread involved in scoping. Do not overlook this tip. Okay, so enough doom and gloom. How do we deal with this? First of all, we need to take it all the way back to requirements, which is not necessarily the first part, but is very early on in the project management life cycle. There are multiple ways you can gather requirements, and I've made a list of some of my favorites. So the first is through observation, and a lot of this will vary depending on the industry that your small business is in, or what type of project you're doing, or the vendors you're working with. But observing what people are doing, what other people have done, how your team works is very critical to informing the requirements of the project. The second is conversation. I love this one. Conversation with other companies that have done this, with vendors and their experiences with other companies, with your client directly, with your team who's worked on this type of thing before, with other SMEs. Conversation is invaluable when it comes to developing your requirements. Third is workshops. So this is where you would pull together your stakeholders and your project team, and you guys would talk through what the end goal is, what you're working with from a resourcing standpoint, and you would define the requirements that way. If you're doing more of an agile approach, you can also do user stories, which is basically for every single outcome of the project, you would tie that back to a user story. Like if you're upgrading your website, you would create a story around like Jane Doe experiences this on the website that they didn't experience before. That's a user story. It's more used in agile and software type projects, but it can apply to other industries as well. There are many, many more tactics for gathering requirements, but you will need your SMEs for this, and do not skip this step. You will want to also track which requirement came from which SME or stakeholder. So if you need to clarify anything down the road, you know exactly who to go to. So we're still on the scoping part here. Once you have your requirements, you are going to need to finalize those requirements. You're going to want to create what project managers call a scope statement. And what the scope statement is going to include is a description of the scope, a list of the deliverables, and this should be pretty detailed, acceptance criteria. So this is, you'll hear DOD a lot, definition of done. What is the definition of done for each of those? What is the acceptance criteria? Are there any exclusions? Are there any constraints? And are there any assumptions for your project? That should all be included in your scope statement And yes, this does take extra time, but it is so important. And I promise you, it will save you money, it will save you time, and it will save your employees a lot of burnout in the long run. The second tip for creating realistic timelines for your small to medium-sized business is understanding dependencies. So this is just if task B cannot get started until task A is complete, task B has a dependency, and that needs to be accounted for in your timelines. You're going to take your scope statement and that detailed list of deliverables, and you're going to break each of those deliverables down into tasks. If there's a task for each deliverable that cannot be completed until the one before it or until something before it is completed, you need to make that note. Highlight it, mark it red, flag it, do something so you come back and you remember that. Missing dependencies is a very common source of delay. So if you can identify your dependencies and flag them and make sure that you sequence your activities correctly, it's going to save you a lot of headache in the long run when all of a sudden you come across something and you're like, oh shoot, we're scheduled to start this today, task B today, but task A isn't set to be complete until tomorrow. So we actually can't start this until tomorrow or even the day after. And all of a sudden you're 2 days behind. I see it all the time on the projects that I work on. Do not skip over dependencies. The third tip is estimating time per task. This is another common source of delays, is not correctly estimating how long something's going to take. How do you figure out how long a task is going to take? Well, are there any standard operating procedures that are already created for that task? If there is, you can study those, you can have some conversations about that. And if not, you probably need to grab your SMEs and talk to them about how to estimate. There are many different estimation techniques when you're looking at deliverables, and we're going to go through a couple of them today. There's expert judgment, which is just your SMEs are telling you how long something's going to take and you're taking their word for it. There is analogous estimating. This is just where you look at how long it's taken on past projects. There's parametric estimating. This is where you look at your historical data and you take how long it typically takes against the quantity. That's a lot of words. If it takes 3 days to remodel a room and you have 4 rooms to remodel, you can do the math that it's going to take about 12 days to complete the 4 rooms. There's something called PERT estimating, which is a whole other formula where you're kind of like figuring out the average. It's a math equation. You can type PERT equation into Google and plug in your numbers. We're not going to get into that today. And then there's bottom-up estimating, which is what I like. You take your deliverables that are broken out into tasks, you sequenced your tasks, and then every single task you're going to break down even further into little micro steps. Every micro step is going to get a time estimation. You'll roll that up into the task, and then you'll roll all the tasks up into the deliverable, and that is your time estimate. And that is usually the most accurate. Do not forget to create buffer time, because people are going to get sick. There's going to be, if you live in Michigan, you're probably going to have some snow days. There's going to be other things that happen. There are always inevitable delays in a project, so always give yourself some buffer time on these. So when you're presenting your timeline to stakeholders, you're giving them something really realistic, and you're also giving yourself the opportunity to even come in a little before schedule if everything by some miracle of life goes perfectly according to plan. The next tip is to understand how to prioritize and set deadlines. So something that a lot of businesses use is the MVP, or the minimum viable product. So you work really hard to get to the MVP, and then kind of the rest of the project has a little bit less heat on it. Stakeholders really want to see that minimum viable product where you start delivering value. When you're understanding how to prioritize and set your deadlines, you need to understand the concept of leads and lags. So an example is if you're painting that room and you need to let the paint dry for 1 day before you put the furniture back, that is a 1-day lag. So identify those things that put you a little bit ahead or a little bit behind, those different dependencies that aren't necessarily directly related to the work your people are doing on the task, and make sure that those are accounted for when you're prioritizing what you can be doing. Maybe you're cleaning the furniture on that day instead of putting the furniture in there and then cleaning it. Also on this, make sure to return to your dependencies, leads and lags. How is that affecting your dependencies? Is there anything there that you didn't spot before that you need to go back and look at? And finally, identify your milestones and also build in time for quality checks. So we talked about acceptance criteria in the scope statement. Make sure that you're building in time for either someone on your team or the project manager to go through and check all of the deliverables against your acceptance criteria, against your quality requirements, against your definition of done, and build in buffer time for inevitable fixes and rework that just naturally happens. We're humans, we're not perfect. So let's just call this what it is. It's a lot, right? So if you have a project you're running that you need help with, or you just want to give this a go, but you don't have the internal resource to dedicate 100% to it, that's where my team comes in. We are project-based consultants. We work in projects all of the time. This is kind of where we thrive. We can also just come in and build some standard operating procedures, so then you can run all of this on your own. You engage us for a couple months, a year, whatever it has to be, and then we're hands-off. We're available if you need us, but your internal teams are just running it on their own. But whether you use us or you just apply this to your internal teams, save yourself the thousands of dollars, save yourself hundreds of hours, and get better about setting realistic project timelines. If you want my help, you can reach out to me directly through the email in my bio. Don't hesitate, I am always around. But if not, I hope you took some value from this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.